I'm reading from the book The Lost Soul of American Politics. This is by John Patrick Diggins. The Lost Soul of American Politics, Virtue, Self-Interest, and the Foundations of Liberalism. This is introduction. Our theory of government is a failure. This is from Henry Adams, 1861. Quote, did Mr. Jefferson really believe that all men are created equal, end quote, asked the passenger next to me, peering over my shoulder. Well, yes and no, I thought, wondering why the elderly southerner would be interested in the book I was reading. Today, certain writers are developing the view that Jefferson never intended his statement to apply to black Americans, and consequently, the Constitution has a meaning and value apart from the Declaration of Independence. If the gentleman is aware of this view, he should also be made aware that Abraham Lincoln refuted such reasoning more than a century ago, and did it by wisely going beyond Jefferson's essentially unprovable doctrine of, quote, natural and, quote, equality. Quote, how could a man as intelligent as Jefferson believe in such nonsense, end quote. The man persisted, looking me in the eye. Recalling Oscar Wilde, I wondered how I could reason someone out of what he had not reasoned himself into, or was it I who was being unreasonable? The man's simple question invited a simple answer. I could not give one. No doubt many Americans today regard as falsehoods what were announced 2 centuries ago as self-evident truths. Perhaps this is why we feel a little unclean when reminded of, quote, our founding fathers, end quote. But how can we best honor them? While Jefferson told us that each generation is sovereign and must therefore think for itself, he also insisted that there are unalienable principles and rights that no generation can efface. I was tempted to reply to the gentleman next to me that Lincoln, even more than Jefferson, believed in equality as a, quote, sacred, end quote, principle enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, a document he regarded as having been born of the blood and mangled limbs of the American Revolution. Through Lincoln, the suffering of the Revolution was made to signify political obligation. Why not then give this man a little lecture on Lincoln? Suddenly the flight attendant announced preparations for landing in Honolulu, and my thoughts shifted from Lincoln back to Jefferson and my long-awaited vacation. From the spiritual politics of, quote, sacrifice, end quote, to the, quote, pursuit of happiness, end quote, we began our descent. Classical political philosophers, from Aristotle to the Founding Fathers to Hannah Arendt, have insisted that for a constitutional republic to survive, it must return to its first principles. The strength and future of a republic depends upon its capacity for periodic self-renewal through the reaffirmation of the pristine ideals that once inspired it. A republic owes its meaning to the act of founding, to the historical, quote, moment, end quote, of its creation. This book concerns the American founders and the meaning given to our republic by their ideas about man and government. It seeks to explore a question central to republicanism. Can we discover in the thoughts of the founders a single first principle that would bind us to the past and restore the authority of older political ideas? Several contemporary scholars have recently argued that we can, and with the forthcoming bicentennial celebration of the Constitution in 1987, most likely there will be still others making such claims. One difficulty with these claims is that the founders themselves seldom agreed with one another. Jefferson looked to the universal principles of the Declaration, as did Lincoln, remaining skeptical of the controlling mechanisms of the Constitution. John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison underrated the Declaration in favor of the Constitution's axioms and structural logic. In the 19th century, Rufus Choate dismissed the ideas of the Declaration as, quote, glittering generalities, end quote. Ralph Waldo Emerson praised them as, quote, blazing ubiquities, end quote. Lacking essential agreement on its first principles, how can America understand itself? One way to attempt answering such a ponderous question is to try to ascertain the political ideas or system of values by which Americans lived in the past. Ever since Alex de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, 1835 through 1838, we have understood why Americans are a conservative people and why America is a liberal society. A society of free political institutions inhabited by individuals who love property and hate revolution. That America itself was born of violent revolution only highlights the irony of the liberalism peculiar to us. A liberalism that embraces radical means to achieve conservative ends, where the American Revolution ushered into expressions of liberalism that would dominate American political thought. The first liberal individualism spearheaded the revolution through the writings of Jefferson and Thomas Paine, convinced that the problems of freedom and justice could be resolved once the forces of oppression were exposed. Jefferson and Paine sought to reduce the authority of government as they extolled the will of the people. The second, as expressed in the writings of Hamilton and Madison, emerged from the Constitutional Convention and came to be regarded as liberal pluralism, convinced that the forces of oppression are rooted in the nature of social existence. Hamilton and Madison contended that people had to be controlled by juxtaposing faction to faction through a mosaic of mechanisms known as checks and balances. One expression of liberalism valued freedom, autonomy, and the sufficiency of the individual. The other, power, stability, and the efficacy of the state. Both identified happiness with property and material pleasure. Neither committed America to political ideas that appealed to man's higher nature. Individualism provided the means by which Americans could pursue their interests, pluralism the means by which they could protect them. The liberal legacy has troubled generations of American intellectuals. Individualism seemed to leave America without a sense of moral community, and pluralism without a sense of national purpose. The liberal heritage has also stymied historians, especially those who recognize that whatever they may have been in their younger, more radical years, they are incurably liberals. The anguished honesty of that attitude was best expressed in Richard Hofstadter's The American Political Tradition and Louis Hart's The Liberal Tradition in America. Hofstadter had found, quote, a kind of mute organic consistency, in quote, in the thoughts of all major statesmen from Jefferson to Herbert Hoover, an ideology of economic individualism that bound Americans to the values of competitive capitalism and made America, quote, a democracy of cupidity rather than a democracy of fraternity, end quote. The ideology could be traced to the founders who had identified liberty with property and conceived political man as a little more than, quote, an atom of self-interest, end quote. Hartz aptly termed the ideology, quote, Lockean ethos, end quote. Not necessarily indicating that all Americans had read John Locke, Two Treatises of Government, but simply that materialist values prevailed in America, a country that had skipped the feudal stage of history and therefore lacked the aristocracy to sustain those values and a proletariat to resist them. The basically Lockean sense of property that the individual had a, quote, natural right, end quote, to acquire, protect, and dispose of his possessions as he chose, became the central faith of the liberal consensus. This, quote, one-dimensional, end quote, mentality was so widespread that even the populist and labor movements, indeed even immigrant workers with their socialist ideals, could not escape America's bourgeois faith. As Hofstadter warned, quote, modern humanist thinkers who seek for a means by which society may transcend eternal conflict and rigid adherence to property rights as its integrating principles can expect no answer in their philosophy of balanced government as it was set down by the Constitution makers of 1787. Quote. This work attempts a new analysis of an old argument, though, as we shall soon see, many post-liberal historians of the 1960s and 1970s, who came after Hartz and Hofstadter, rejected the idea of a liberal tradition in America. I do not deny that liberalism has dominated the country's political culture, why many intellectuals are thereby alienated from politics, and why American politics has, since Lincoln's death, lost its moral vision, are some of the questions this work seeks to answer. Another is whether the Republic's first principles are themselves inadequate. Hartson Hofstadter, who sought to explain the failure of American radicalism, approached liberalism with that question primarily in mind. This work is concerned with the political ideas and assumptions of the founders and their immediate hearers. Before even attempting to, quote, transcend, end quote, those ideas, we need to scrutinize them in light of their intended aims and purposes. The overriding objective of the founders was to establish a republican form of government, a system of rule without a monarchy in which the people chose who they wished to represent them. To this end, the founders sought to learn from history in order to defy the past. The founders undertook the daring challenge not only of establishing a republic, but also of laying down the conditions for its perpetuation, knowing full well that all past attempts at preserving republican liberty have failed, except for the petty and precarious republics of the Middle Ages that had, in John Adams' words, quote, foamed, raised, and burst like so many water spouts upon the ocean, end quote. America was the first major attempt at republican government since the fall of Rome. In devising this new and highly problematic, quote, experiment, end quote, the founders dealt with some of the most perplexing issues in Western political thoughts: power and liberty, authority and sovereignty, the alienated human condition, the, quote, fall, unquote, truth and change, language and reality, the dignity of labor and the dangers of luxury, and the paradox revealed in the Federalists: how to make self-government work with people who may be incapable of governing themselves. Did the founders succeed in the task they assigned themselves? Henry Adams, the great grandson of John Adams, and America's most brilliant and burdened historian, doubted that they did. He judged the Constitution, quote, delusive, end quote, chimerical, end quote, and a, quote, failure, end quote, because it had failed to do what the Federalist authors assured it would do: control power. Tocqueville, the most brilliant analysis on America, tried to show that the American Republic could neither be explained nor preserved by the principles that the founders enunciated in 1787. As we shall see, even the preservation of property would not have been possible had it depended on, as the founders assumed it did, on the classical thesis that, quote, balancing, quote, government could control social conflict. In studying American liberalism, most historians have focused almost solely on the political ideas, and have therefore slighted the religious convictions that often undergirded them, especially the Calvinist convictions that Locke himself held: resistance to tyranny, original sin, and the corruptibility of man, labor and the, quote, calling, unquote, as a means of salvation, and the problem of man's infinite and insatiable desires, which compel him to be in, quote, constant pursuit, end quote, of happiness. Thus, the social and economic implications of the liberal tradition have been examined almost to the exclusion of its moral content, and even its psychological depth. John Adams and the Federalist authors may have drawn upon Calvinism to explain why man cannot overcome his sinful nature, but it was not until Lincoln and Herman Melville that Calvinism became the conscience of liberalism. It is significant that when they returned to America's first principles, they returned to the Declaration and the Puritan Covenant, and not the Constitution. The Constitution merely provided the framework for the procedural mechanisms of government, what Lincoln called, quote, the picture of silver, end quote, whereas the Declaration offered the substantive ideals and the ends of the nation, quote, the apple of gold, end quote. Once we see the Calvinist foundations of liberalism, the gospel of, quote, free labor, end quote, that Lincoln espoused as the essence of liberty, we are in a better position to see why in American intellectual history liberalism could carry the seeds of its own condemnation, particularly in its fostering of capitalism as ends came to absorb means, wealth to replace work, and the mere possession of things to replace the making of products as the nation threatened to sink into a morass of materialism. Many early American thinkers addressed this problem, one that today might be concerned by liberals, radicals, and even conservatives, at least those conservatives who can tell the difference between immediate corporate profits and genuine industrial productivity, between making money and making goods, yet the ethical contradictions of capitalist culture. The farmer who has God on his lips and cotton on his mouth, the businessman who speaks of freedom and is a slave to wealth, the worker who, given the first opportunity, forsakes labor for leisure, have generally gone unexplored in traditional historiography. This is especially true of the progressive scholars who dominated American historical writings for almost the first half of the 20th century. Charles A. Beard, clearly the most provocative and controversial and perhaps influential of all modern American historians, tended to ignore the theological nonsenses of American political ideas. Thus, Beard refused to accept Madison's conviction that social conflict is inevitable because human nature is, quote, sown, end quote, with the conditions of its own alienation. Even more significantly, Vernon L. Parrington, author of the monumental 3-volume Main Currents in American Thought, saw liberalism and Calvinism as fundamentally antagonistic, writing in an era when, like Prohibition, Puritanism became the scapegoat of the intellectuals, and Parrington hoped to rescue America from, quote, the great barbecue, end quote, of materialism by sending John Edwards back to the Middle Ages and bringing Thomas Jefferson to the 20th century. Progressive historiography did much to foster the traditional view that liberalism stood for reason, freedom, and moral progress, while Calvinism sought to terrify man with irrationality, predestination, and human depravity. Yet the distinction is less a difference of ideas than of images. Jonathan Edwards had no trouble assimilating Locke when he sought to demonstrate that man must resist oppressive government to worship freely, even though he lacks free will. And Locke's Christian convictions that man is moved to work by a, quote, fantastical uneasiness, end quote, was scarcely incompatible with Ben Franklin's rationalist conviction that the prudent man must keep busy to avoid pain and find pleasure in activity itself. Nor was it incompatible with Lincoln's Calvinistic conviction that work was imposed by an angry God as man's burden for having fallen from grace. What Calvinism and liberalism shared was the problem of alienation, and whether man was alienated from God or from himself. The Federalist makes clear why man is incapable of self-government and hence must be subjected to external controls, what Madison aptly called, quote, auxiliary precautions, end quote. Edwards, On the Nature of True Virtue, contained for Americans a message far more disturbing than anything that might have been found in Machiavelli's classic writings. That virtue could not be determined by an act of political will alone, leading American political thinkers who had not escaped Calvinism's pervasive influence thus found themselves in a dialogue of refutation with their counterparts in Europe. Bolingbroke stated, true moral virtue is something very real. It is the cause of our happiness. And Adams stated, this is divine and eternal truth, but alas, how shall we define true moral virtue, and where shall we find it? And continuing, rather than repudiating its religious heritage, American political thought has largely absorbed it in spirit, if not in language. Progressive historians may have sought to save America from the corruptions of materialism by looking forward to science and progress. Lincoln and Melville may have sought to save it by looking backward, defining the Declaration of Independence and reinvoking the Christian principles of, quote, sacrifice, end quote, and, quote, forgiveness, end quote. Yet the deeper stream beneath the, quote, main currents, end quote, of American thought could be the interrelated tradition of Lockeanism and Calvinism, a tradition that came to be slightly modified in the Constitution. When David Hume replaced Locke and the idea of the factions, the worry of classical politics was now legitimated. But whether American thinkers were articulating Calvinism and Hume, as did Adams, Hamilton, and Madison, or reaffirming the Lockean Calvinist tradition as the writings of Melville and Lincoln suggested, or even reacting to the materialist ramifications and moral repressions of that tradition, as we find Emerson and Thoreau doing, that tradition cannot simply be dismissed by recent historians as a, quote, myth, end quote. and, end quote, obsession, end quote, the misbegotten, quote, false consciousness, end quote, of liberalism from which America must consciously liberate itself. Such dismissals come from three distinct schools of thought or points of view that have tried, by explicating the writings of the founders and other social philosophers, to challenge the liberal interpretation of American political consciousness and establish for it a new identity: classical republicanism, Scottish moral philosophy, and Marxism. Although proponents of each of these perspectives may have many differences and even deep political disagreements with proponents of the other two, all are in agreement on two convictions: that moral ideas and culture are more important than material interests and power as motives of human action, and that, therefore, liberalism, an ideology based upon the realities of interest politics, interest politics, and man's, quote, fallen, end quote, alienated condition, an ideology that derives from Lockeanism and Calvinism, cannot, should not, and does not explain America. Classical republicanism, which has been variously referred to as a civic humanism, Republican ideology, classical politics, the Commonwealth, tradition, dissent, and opposition, and radical Whig thought, is perhaps the dominant theme in contemporary scholarship on early American political ideas and culture. Its leading exponents seek to demonstrate that American history has consisted in more than what liberals have perceived: groups vying with one another over opportunity, privilege, contract, and other issues that would legitimate the interests of each by either defining the nature of property or defending the rights of labor, while not denying the reality of economic interests. Classical republicanism stresses the primacy of politics, especially old world political ideas that supposedly mediated the conflicts in American history, by leading Americans to see them as replications of the parliamentary struggles that have taken place in England. Thus, the American Revolution is interpreted not as a Lockean effort to protect property from taxation and regulation, but as a Machiavellian effort to preserve the young republic's, quote, virtue, end quote, from the corrupt and corrupting forces of English politics. The idea of republicanism had its origins in classical antiquity, found its most profound political expression in Renaissance humanism, and culminated in certain aspects of the 18th century Enlightenment. The moral extortions of Cicero, the political theories of Machiavelli, and the constitutional devices of Montesquieu were its rich legacy. In republicanism, true citizenship is founded upon the demands of, quote, virtue, end quote, a political idea whose realization required not only the people's direct participation in civic affairs, but the subordination of their interests to the public good. A republic, however, is always threatened by its own impermanence, for the passage of time softened the citizenry moral fiber, brought wealth and luxury, and especially in English politics, undermined the austere rural values of the quote, country, end quote, party, making it possible for the corruptions of the, quote, court, end quote, party to prevail. And since the court ministers who served the monarchy often stood for trade and economic development, historical change brought with it the threat of virtues being subverted by commerce, which would lead to the republic's moral deterioration. Preoccupied with his self-interest and indifferent to the public good, the corrupt man would then have no memory of the original ideas of the republic and would thus be incapable of practicing citizenship. This inevitable process of corruption can be arrested only through the periodic revitalization that can be brought about by returning to the original principles, recapturing the concept of civic virtue. Many of the thinkers who will be discussed in this work were aware of classical republicanism. Thus, it presented a traditional body of political thought clearly available to them. The extent to which they drew upon it, revised it, ignored it, or consciously examined and then discarded it as a historical problem that has yet to be carefully investigated. The second approach, one that aims to, quote, explain, end quote, America by interpreting the text of the founders, concentrates on the influence of Scottish moral philosophy, which is presented as the antithesis of Lockean liberalism. Francis Hutchinson, David Hume, Adam Smith, and other Scottish philosophers were well known to Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and John Adams. These philosophers sought to elevate Locke's materialist epistemology by granting to the human mind the finer dimensions of aesthetics and ethics. Hutchinson in particular argued for the existence of a, quote, moral sense, end quote, an innate faculty that enabled man not only to pursue pleasure, but to act in ways that contributed to the common good. Society was thus held together not by the competitive interplay of interests, but by ethical actions that emanated from, quote, benevolence, end quote, a principle that constituted the basis of social order for some Scottish philosophers. It was because of these altruistic tendencies that the other regarding ideals of, quote, sympathy, end quote, community, end quote, and, quote, virtue, end quote, supposedly surmounted even the self-regarding desires for private property. Because America can be seen as having as its foundation a communal rather than an individual political philosophy, one that made the public good, not private gratification, the noble end of government. No doubt Scottish thought influenced the founding American founders, but perhaps in different ways from what we have been led to believe. We shall explore whether the Scottish idea of virtue had a specific political content, whether the idea of the moral sense compelled Jefferson to act morally, and whether Hume's philosophy influenced the Federalist authors to regard property as a communal right to be shared rather than a private interest to be protected. The third school of thought that offers an alternative to the liberal interpretation of American history is Marxism. Contemporary Marxist historians have investigated such subjects as master-slave relations and the antebellum South, whose, quote, pre-liberal and, quote, aristocratic and paternalistic culture somehow escaped the grasping acquisitiveness of liberal America. The thoughts of radical writers like Paine and Thoreau, who supposedly offered a Marxist or, quote, pre-Marxist, end quote, critique of American society, and the plight of cultural conservatives like Henry Adams, who feared, we are told, both the curse of modernity and the collapse of capitalism. Marxists who find the idealist sentiments of community and, quote, moral economy, quote, an economy of provision rather than profit in the working class, see corruption and alienation almost everywhere else. Thus, just as classical republicanism offers the idea of a citizenship when interpreting American history, Marxism offers the ideas of comradeship. The neoclassical historian may emphasize virtue, the Scottish exponent benevolence, or the Marxist solidarity, but all three minimize what Tocqueville saw as the essential egoisme and individualisme of the American character. The Marxist interpretation of American intellectual history needs to be scrutinized with respect to three issues: the problem of class and class conflict, the problem of alienation, and the problem of hegemony. How American society came to be dominated by the liberal ethos. While Tocqueville saw, quote, proletarian, end quote, class consciousness as the missing ingredient in the American history, Thoreau saw alienation arising from the very activity that Marx assumed would eliminate it, the life of productive work as opposed to contemplative thought, and Lincoln traced the necessity of labor to God's, quote, quote, curse, end quote, upon mankind. Thus, what Thoreau perceived as the damnation of liberal capitalist America, and Lincoln as its possible redemption, was a pervasive ideology that must be confronted. The ideology of Calvinism, which led the Federalist authors to see alienation as inevitable, and Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe to see slavery as sinful. In the course of writing this book, I came to a belated appreciation of an older Marxist and progressive perspective, emphasizing conflict. This came as a surprise to me, as it may strike some readers as strange, having criticized Marxism for the past decade. I may now seem to be a, quote, twice born, end quote, historical materialist. Some might welcome this term, others would pray for my soul. But reconsideration is far from a conversion. Rather than becoming convinced of the validity of Marxism, I remain unconvinced of the efforts of recent historians to supersede the economic interpretation of history. Indeed, I am more inclined than ever to believe that Marxism and the economic realism of the American framers of the Constitution had much in common, a sense of class conflict that never materialized, as we shall see a view of man as alienated and incapable of subduing his, quote, interests, and, quote, passions, and, quote, and thus prone to, quote, vex and oppress, end quote, others, and a skeptical conviction that political ideas like virtue may be little more than illusions that console the conscience, but do not control the will. Such convictions by no means make the Federalist authors Marxists, but they may help explain why the American founders could do what no contemporary politician would dare think of doing: tell the truth about humanity. Contemporary historians who make virtue the main theme of early American political philosophy are repudiating the liberal thesis that saw the reality and value of property as central to American thought and politics. These historians have replaced Locke and Jonathan Edwards with Machiavelli and Montesquieu, making man's relationship to politics, government, and civic activity, and not his relationship to God, nature, land, labor, and material enterprise, the central focus of early American history. This work seeks to question such trends not only by demonstrating the extent to which economic determinism influenced the beliefs of the framers, but also by delineating the demise of classical politics and the persistence of both Lockean and Calvinist sentiments. The classical idea of virtue as resistance to political corruption and a patriotic subordination of private interests to the public good was an idea whose time had come and gone by 1787, when the Constitution was framed. Washington had not seen Americans behaving virtuously during the Revolution, and Adams, Hamilton, and Madison did not expect it of them when they drafted the Constitution, yet the language of classical thought continued in the Jacksonian era. If language is reality, we would have to accept as true the pronouncements of both the Democrats and the Whigs, that each party stood for, quote, virtue, end quote, and its opponents for, quote, tyranny, end quote. Thus one wonders whether the rhetoric of traditional classical politics is sufficient to explain what was actually going on then, as some new Jacksonian scholars have suggested. Politics, of course, is only possible in the presence of language, but truth and reality may be independent of the language of politics. We shall explore whether it was their common language or the class divisions that often went unacknowledged in political discourse that explains the behavior of the Democrats and the Whigs. Historians tell us that the idea of political virtue led early Americans to be suspicious of the British. The Calvinist idea of virtue, it might be added, requires us to be suspicious about ourselves. The framers were critical of ideas that promoted man's good opinion of himself. John Adams even regarded political language as a temptation of self-deceit. Returning to the sober reflections of the founders and other political thinkers, I have conceived this book as a Niebuhrian corrective to the pretensions of American virtue. Daniel Webster may have seen himself as virtuous and possibly was so, but Noah Webster, who knew a little about the importance of language and its relation to reality, and who had once championed Republican ideology, so despaired of the absence of classical ideals in America that he all but dropped the word virtue from his dictionary as obsolete. Orestes A. Brownson failed to detect virtue inspiring the duties of statesmanship, and Rufus Choate vainly searched for it in the spirit of law. Catherine Beecher and Horace Bushnell hoped to rescue it from its misuses in politics by having it nurtured in the Christian household, while Horace Mann and John Witherspoon chose to nurture it in the schoolroom. James Fenimore and Cooper found it in his noble Indians, and Henry Adams in his rebellious heroines, and men and women undefiled by politics and uncorrupted by power. Perhaps, as John Adams has suggested, the idea that virtue could elevate politics was a myth to begin with, part of Machiavelli's, quote, humorous entertainment, end quote. George Bernard Shaw once remarked that England and the United States are two countries separated by a common language, that England and America may share a common political language and similar political institutions, can easily lead one to believe that the categories of old world politics apply directly to the new world. In the 19th century, however, many American thinkers continued to espouse their country's independence of old world categories. George Bancroft, America's most eminent historian, remained convinced that such categories had to give way to newer perspectives if the country's debilitating materialism was to be overcome. Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America to demonstrate to Montesquieu's disciples that a republic could flourish without virtue, and that society and social relations are more important than politics and political institutions. Emerson and Thoreau, America's leading moralists, went further than Tocqueville, dismissing politics as, quote, cunning, end quote, the state as a, quote, trick, end quote, and even society itself as the trap of, quote, quiet desperation, end quote. Whitman, the bard who believed America could overcome anything by simply affirming everything, summed up in 4 words America's answer to political authority, quote, resist much, obey little, end quote. It may be tempting to see in classical political ideals an answer to the problems of American liberalism, its competitive ethos, its, quote, possessive individualism, end quote, its economic interpretation of politics, but the framers of the Constitution and most 19th century thinkers as well recognize the essence of the problem. Liberal man wanted self-government, not necessarily the ideals of virtue that would enable him to govern the self. Even outside the formal discourse of political thought, the idea of virtue becoming problematic. For Nathaniel Hawthorne, it is the sin of pride as man cowers before society. For Melville, the tragedy of authority as it grinds coldly toward the murder of innocence. Indeed, Melville wrote on political themes in Billy Budd. He drew not on Machiavelli or Montesquieu, but on a mind more suited to the paradoxes of virtue itself, Jonathan Edwards. And when Lincoln faced the Civil War crisis, he drew not on classical thought, but on the very tradition that Machiavelli wanted to purge from politics and statecraft, the moral concepts of Christianity. While we see the conscience of Puritanism persisting in certain aspects of American intellectual history, its political history, we see the emergence of Lockean individualism. What preoccupied the thoughts of major statesmen from Jackson to Lincoln was not so much the political duty of the citizen as the economic opportunity of the worker and entrepreneur. Whether Jackson attacked the Bank of the United States or Lincoln the slave system of the South, both leaders did much to bring into politics a labor theory of value. The Lockean principle that property is the outcome of human exertion was anathema to conservative Whiggism and Southern political economy alike, where property was regarded as prior to labor, and the American liberal thought it was work, not politics, that enabled man to live an independent and productive life. The value derived from labor, that indeed work itself could be a virtuous activity, was a notion and entirely alien to classical political thought. A word about organization. This book involves methodological as well as substantive issues. For much of my curiosity about recent historiography arose from doubts concerning 2 implicit assumptions. A, that the ideas known as, quote, classical republicanism, end quote, and, quote, civic humanism, end quote, are sufficient to account for the, quote, origins, end quote, of the American Revolution, and B, that the ideas used in political discourse can therefore be considered to the true motives of action because they appear in the, quote, language paradigm, end quote, of a particular historical era. These 2 technical issues, whether the rhetoric of the revolution reveals its causes and whether language illuminates reality, are taken up in an historiographical and methodological appendix to which I shall occasionally refer the interested reader. With methodological issues thus relegated to the rear, the book addresses substantive matters involving the ideas of various generations of American intellectuals and political leaders, but the organization is not always strictly chronological. The two historical events most relevant to classical political thought are the Constitution and the American Republic was conceived and established in the Civil War, when it was threatened and preserved. Thus, one of the early chapters deals with the thoughts of John Adams and the Federalist authors on the Constitution, and the last chapter concludes with Lincoln's meditations on the war and the Union. Certain issues that had to be dealt with in other places, however, forced me to go beyond the Civil War to address some problems directly relevant to classical republicanism. Henry Adams, for example, wrote in the post-Civil War era, yet he explored more thoughtfully than any other American writer the old world problem of the corruption of politics by wealth, even the subversion of, quote, virtue, end quote, by, quote, commerce, end quote. And when he commented on the state of the American politics, the fate of classical politics was uppermost in his mind. Charles Beard was also troubled by corruption, and Walter Lippmann even wrote a book about, quote, virtue, end quote. Thus it proved impossible for me to avoid a short glance at the progressive era, perhaps the last time intellectuals regarded corruption as a serious issue of political philosophy. The frontier and populism are also briefly discussed, primarily to suggest that, contrary to the claims of some contemporary historians, the West not only failed to cultivate virtue, but that nature and wilderness have, like labor, no important role in classical political thought. And in a section dealing with American attitudes towards history, a concern central to classical thought, I examined the views of Jefferson, Emerson, and even the 20th century philosopher John Dewey, with whom the revolt against the authority of classical knowledge culminates in the repudiation of history itself. But these matters are only brief excursions beyond the Civil War. That historical crisis when American political thought faced its greatest challenge, when Lincoln recognized that the disparity between property as a reward for labor and property as a justification for slavery, the choice between, quote, the man or the dollar, end quote, could no longer be ignored. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it was Stephen Douglas who assumed the Machiavellian position that moral issues cannot be allowed to enter political discourse. Whether slavery was right or wrong, it had to be accepted as an unalterable fact of political existence. Douglas' position expresses perfectly what Isaiah Berlin has called, quote, this painful truth that Machiavelli forced on our attention, end quote. The lesson that to survive a republic must, quote, tolerate error, end quote, and live with, quote, evil, end quote. In opposing Douglas, Lincoln returned to the founders, uniting liberalism with Christianity to interpret slavery as a transgression of God's law, a transgression that could be absolved only by a recommitment to the principle of human equality, the very principle that had, quote, brought forth, end quote, the nation itself. The Machiavellian tradition of Republican humanism called upon the citizen to control his passions and subordinate his interests to the public good, the res publica. Why did that tradition fail to survive in America? In a single observation, indeed. In 3 words, the political philosopher Edmund Burke made a characteristically offhanded remark that may help to answer that question. Machiavelli, Burke observed, is, quote, intelligence without property, end quote. In putting civic virtue ahead of man's means of subsistence and freedom, Machiavelli violated a sentiment that would be deeply felt by thinkers as diverse as Burke, Locke, Jefferson, Veblen, Marx, Dostoevsky, Tocqueville, and Lincoln. First, give the people land so that they can feed themselves, and then ask them to be virtuous. Between Machiavelli and Locke lies the dilemma of American politics. Classical political philosophy aims to discipline man's desires and raise him far above his vulgar wants. Liberalism promises to realize desires and satisfy wants. The first is more noble, the second more attainable. A liberal society dedicated to nothing more than the pursuit of self-interest and the pleasures of consumption. America certainly could stand to heed Machiavelli's public philosophy, and particularly so today, when we no longer have Calvinism to save liberalism from its most unoriginal sin, complacency. But the challenge facing the historian of classical republicanism is essentially the challenge that John Adams threw down to Bolingbroke, Machiavelli, and Montesquieu. Instead of relying on the language of virtue, we must study closely the actions of those who claim to be virtuous. Since words are often portrayed by deeds, the point is not to believe in virtue but to find it. At the risk of a grotesque generalization, I would like to suggest that what has characterized American political thought and culture since the Revolution is not the presence of civic virtues, but the absence of Christian values, and whether one could be restored without the other was a problem that preoccupied such important 19th century thinkers as Bronson, Beecher, Bushnell, Cooper, Tocqueville, Melville, Lincoln, and Henry Adams. Some writers looked to institutionalize Christianity as a means of sustaining the Republic, others to the theological insights of Calvinism to comprehend the meaning of experience, still others to the mystical faith of Roman Catholicism to find a foundation of belief for a liberal society, uneasy with the constraints of any idea of authority. George Santayana, the 20th century expatriate philosopher who believed rather whimsically that America could find its soul only after it had lost its mind, remained convinced that liberalism and Protestantism had dominated the American mind. Liberalism had given the American male the natural right to be free, become rich, and escape his martial vows, while Calvinism assured that he could do none of these without experiencing guilt. At the highest reaches of the American mind, Calvinism had bred, quote, an agonized conscience, end quote, that Santayana aptly defined as, quote, the joys of an unhappiness that confesses itself, end quote. For the soul of American liberalism, there is nothing better than an open confession.